Welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Coelho, and Caritas is dedicated to promote the evolution of consciousness as the key to both individual and global healing. We do this online through interviews and presentations by guest speakers. We also have classes and study groups that we do online, and you can check those out on our website if you're not already getting our announcements. We draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading edge studies in science and consciousness, spirituality and philosophy. And we've been doing this for nearly 19 years. But in 2019, we began recording our presentations, and our video recordings are viewable through our website, caritascenter.org, and also on our YouTube channel, which is Caritas Consciousness Project. I think we have about 80 so far, so check it out. Wonderful presenters. As a nonprofit, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep our program going. If you enjoy our presentations and would like to support this program, we really appreciate it. You can make a donation or become a member. There's benefits to being a member, which you can see on our website. And now let me introduce tonight's guest speaker, or today's guest speaker, I'm sorry. I'm used to doing this in the evening, but the thing is that Steve Taylor lives in the UK. So if we did it in the evening, it would be the middle of the night for him. So we don't want to do that. We'll spare him that. Steve Taylor is the author of many best-selling books on spirituality and psychology, including The Leap, The Calm Center, and his new book, Extraordinary Awakenings, which I have right here. And it is an amazing book. I recommend it for everyone. I think everyone should read this book because we all have crises, and this gives us tremendous insight onto the possibilities that can come from those crises. For the last 10 years, Steve has been included in Mind, Body, Spirit magazine's list of the 100 most spiritually influential living people. He's a lecturer and researcher in psychology at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. And Eckhart Tolle has referred to his work very appropriately, in my opinion, as an important contribution to the shift in consciousness that is happening on our planet. And his website is www.steven with a V, mtaylor.com, STEVENM Taylor.com. Welcome, Steve. Thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate your taking the time, and I am honored to hear your presentation. And we will save questions to the end, but if you have a question and you don't want to forget it, you can type it in the chat in the meantime. And also, when the time comes for questions, if you want to ask a question and your video is not on, please type it in the chat so we don't have a black screen on our recording. And if you have your video on, feel free to ask your question out loud. Steve, thank you very much, and I will yield the platform to you. This so-called speech.
Thanks, Gloria. Hi, everybody. Great to be with you. I'm gonna, as Gloria said, I'm going to mainly speak about my book, Extraordinary Awakenings, and I'm going to talk about the transformational power of turmoil and trauma. I'll give you some examples of the people I've interviewed, and we'll explore the reasons why turmoil and trauma can sometimes have a powerful spiritual effect, why they can sometimes lead to spiritual awakening. And towards the end, I'll lead you through an exercise to illustrate the transformational power of turmoil. I mean, one of the interesting things about it is that everybody goes through trauma at some point in their lives. It's part of human life that, that we experience suffering, even intense suffering from time to time. But not everybody experiences spiritual transformation in the midst or in the aftermath of trauma. So I'm going to look at some of the reasons why some people experience transformation while others don't. And I'll take you through an exercise to illustrate that point or those points. I'd like to begin though with a poem. I write poetry, so I'd like to begin with a poem that I sometimes use at the beginning of talks or workshops, just as a way of kind of introducing the session, and also a way of sort of dropping the past and enabling us to become fully present. I think often when human beings encounter one another, we bring certain aspects of the past into the present. You know, we carry thoughts from the past, we carry preconceptions, intentions, and so forth. But we, you know, to meet somebody fully in the present, we need to let go of all of those things. And that enables us to feel the entirety or the wholeness of each other's being. And so this is a poem which discusses that idea of letting go of all preconceptions when you meet somebody. It's called Meeting Purely in Presence. Let's meet without pretense, without hierarchies of status or artificial shows of respect, without trying to impress each other with our knowledge or charm or humor. Let's meet without fear of exposing our vulnerabilities, without being embarrassed by our need for love or pretending to be self-sufficient. Let's meet without the past, without letting our urge to connect be obstructed by old resentments, without letting our natural empathy be blocked by hard, fixed prejudice. Let's meet without insecurity. No, we don't have to prove that we're worthy of each other's affection, since love doesn't need to be earned or gained, but simply allowed to flow. Let's meet without intentions, without any designs or goals, knowing we don't have to try to relate to each other because we're already related, knowing that there's nothing we need to do except allow ourselves to be. Let's meet purely in presence, without any conditions or concepts, knowing that in essence we are the same, and that in being we are one. So maybe just for a moment, let's close our eyes for a moment. Let's close our eyes for a moment, and I'll lead you through a very short meditation, just to maybe we can sense the oneness that I've just been discussing in that poem. Just close your eyes for a moment and bring your attention to your breathing for a moment. Just feel the air as it enters and leaves your nose. Feel the air brushing the inside of your nose as you breathe in, and again as you breathe out. Feel how your stomach rises and falls with your breathing. Feel how, with each breath, you become a little more relaxed. Each breath becomes a bit deeper and longer, slower. If any thoughts enter your mind, just return your attention to your breathing. Just feeling the air, again, brushing the inside of your nose as you breathe in and out. And now, let's bring our attention inwards into our own inner space, into our own consciousness. Just feel the energy of your consciousness. Be aware of any thoughts or feelings that may be passing through your consciousness. See if you can locate a place inside your consciousness where you watch your thoughts pass by, where you can observe your feelings arising and then fading away. See if you can find that point of observation within your own mind. And once you're located there, imagine that you're just sitting on a riverbank on a warm summer's day, sitting still while the stream flows by beneath you. Imagine that the stream is your thoughts just passing by, flowing by. And you can just sit still without attaching yourself to your thoughts, allowing them to fade away into the distance. If any thoughts do take you away, just bring yourself back to that point of stillness, that place on the riverbank where you observe thoughts and feelings passing by. Maybe you can sense the spaciousness of your consciousness, of your inner space. Sense the vast space inside you, stretching around you, even seeming to be stretching beyond your body. You can also sense a stillness within this space, a radiant stillness, an emptiness. And within this space, you can sense that there is a connection between us. You can sense that we share this inner space, that within this inner space, we are one, beyond the boundaries of our minds and bodies. So let's just experience the peaceful oneness that we share in this moment, the oneness of being. And now let's return our attention again to our breathing for a few moments. Also be aware of the points where your body makes contact with the environment around you, with the chair or the floor that you're sitting on. Be aware of the clothes that you're wearing, touching your skin. And now let's slowly open our eyes again and return our attention to this session. Now, I'm going to speak about the transformational power of trauma and turmoil. And I'll begin by telling you how I became interested in this area. And it goes back to my own teenage years when I was a depressed and alienated young man. And I used to spend a lot of time on my own because I only really felt comfortable on my own. I didn't have any social skills. I found it very hard to be with other people. So I used to wander around quite a lot on my own. And every so often when I was in nature, I would have powerful experiences which I didn't understand at the time. I would feel a sense of harmony with my surroundings, and everything around me seemed to be alive and to be fresh and beautiful, as if an extra dimension of reality had revealed itself. So I felt lifted above my normal depression and alienation, and I felt, a sense of connection to my surroundings and a feeling that life was harmonious and meaningful and beautiful. Then the experiences would fade. They'd maybe last for a few minutes, maybe an hour or two at the most. Then I'd return to my normal state. But when I began to think about these experiences later on in my life, I wondered if the depression and turmoil that I was experiencing was somehow connected to these experiences, if the depression had somehow created these euphoric spiritual experiences. I didn't understand the experiences at the time. I thought that maybe they were further evidence that there was something wrong with me, that I was crazy. But fortunately, when I was in my early 20s, I stumbled on, or maybe I didn't stumble on, maybe in some way I gravitated towards them, but I discovered books about spirituality and mystical experiences, and I recognized my own experiences. I thought, wow, I'm not crazy after all. And, so I began to create a framework to understand my experiences. I began to realize that I was a spiritual seeker or a spiritual explorer or a spiritual experiencer. So, it was a great feeling to be able to understand these experiences and to have a context to make sense of them. And a few years later, I discovered a field of psychology called transpersonal psychology, which really means spiritual psychology. And as soon as I had read about transpersonal psychology, I thought, wow, this is me. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to be. I want to study spirituality from a psychological perspective. And one of the things I wanted to do was try to understand the experiences I'd had, these spiritual experiences, which seemed to arise for no particular reason, these moments of harmony in nature. So that's what I did. One of the things I did when I became involved in transpersonal psychology, I went back to university to do a master's degree and then a PhD. One of the things I wanted to do was to research these experiences, to find out how common they were, and to find out whether they were connected to any particular situations or contexts. So that's what I did. I'll share a couple of slides with you now, just to illustrate some of the things I looked into in my research. So I began to research what I called awakening experiences. And I'm going to ask you this question now. Actually, I'll ask you this question. You can write your answer in the chat box. Have you ever had an awakening experience in which your awareness of reality has intensified and expanded? This could be an experience in which your surroundings have become brighter and more real, and you've become struck by the unusual beauty and vividness of things. Perhaps you felt a sense of connection to them and a deep sense of well-being inside you. Perhaps you felt a sense of harmony and meaning pervade the world, a sense that all things are one and you are part of this oneness. The experience may have left you with a sense that life is more meaningful. So yeah, to just tell me in the chat box if you had that kind of experience. Maybe you could also mention if the experiences you've had are connected to any particular situation or context. For example, when I have these experiences, they're often connected to nature. I get these feelings a lot when I'm walking in the countryside, in a forest, or on the hills, or swimming in a lake. Some people may have these experiences during prayer or meditation. But maybe if you've had these experiences, maybe you could mention which context they've arisen in. I'll just have a quick look at the chat box. Nisha says, in relationship with others. Yeah, these experiences, they sometimes occur in loving relationships or in situations of intimacy, when we feel we are deeply connected with one another. But, oh, excuse me. Gloria says, often in nature, even yesterday on a walk with my brother, with beautiful sunset views over the reservoir. Yeah, that sounds beautiful. And nature is one of the major sources of these experiences. If you look into, there are so many poets who've written about these kinds of experiences in nature. Nature seems to have an intense power to induce these states of consciousness. But I wanted to find out in my research, what are the major triggers of these experiences? Oh, Renee says, oh, hi, Renee. After the death of my friend. That's right. Yeah, I remember. I actually write about you in this book, don't I? If you don't know, Renee is one of the people I write about in my book, Extraordinary Awakenings. Because, yeah, Renee had a very powerful awakening experience through bereavement. Susan says, in a dream. That's interesting. Yeah, they're not so common in dreams, but I have read other examples of awakening experiences in dreams. But this is what I found in my research, which is on the next slide. Oh, excuse me, I'm trying to remove the chat. Oh, here we go. So I did a few years ago, I did a study of 91 awakening experiences with a colleague, Katrina. And we found that the most common trigger of these experiences was bereavement. Well, not bereavement, sorry, psychological turmoil in general, including stress, depression, or loss or bereavement. So 37 out of 91 experiences were connected to psychological turmoil. And then the next common trigger was contact with nature, which I've just discussed. Also spiritual practice, which could include meditation, prayer, or yoga. Also reading spiritual literature. So those were the major triggers. So we were very surprised that psychological turmoil was such a powerful trigger of these experiences. In a way, it doesn't seem to make sense, because we're talking about experiences of joy, relief, transcendence, bliss. So it seems paradoxical that these experiences should arise in situations of trauma and turmoil. It's like shifting from one opposite to the polar opposite, shifting from despair to joy in an instant. Let me give you a couple of examples. This is an awakening experience which occurred in the midst of the intense trauma of warfare. This was a man who was fighting in Vietnam in 1969. He sent me this report a few years ago, and this is how he described it. With casualties mounting, I was in a state of high anxiety. I figured there was no way I'd live through this seemingly endless battle. At one point, after carrying yet another severely wounded Marine to a waiting chopper, something happened to me. It's actually indescribable, but I'll make a feeble attempt to do so. I opened up, literally, from my perspective. I came out of myself. I expanded infinitely. I disappeared. It didn't last long, but it was the most powerful experience I've ever had. he was only a young man. I think he was 24 years old when he had this experience, so he didn't understand it. But when he returned from Vietnam, he knew intuitively that the way to make sense of this experience was through spirituality. So he went to meditation sessions, he went to Buddhist groups, and he was trying to, in a way, he was trying to make sense of his experience, but also trying to regain this experience. He told me a few years ago that he'd never regained this experience fully, but he'd had glimpses of it. But just this one experience had completely changed his life. It had opened up this new spiritual dimension to his life. And it had turned him into a spiritual seeker. It had given him a new sense of meaning and purpose in his life. That's not uncommon. You know, these experiences are very short. This one probably lasted a few seconds, but they can be life-changing. Here's another example. This was a young woman who was suffering from depression. She had actually attempted suicide and she was in hospital recovering. And one morning she woke up and there was a marble on her bedside table in the hospital. And she had no idea why it was there. But she picked up the marble and it became, well, I'll just read out what she said. The marble became a symbol of reality. It became a symbol of oneness. This is how she described it when she was looking at this marble. I saw reality as simply this perfect oneness. I felt suddenly removed from everything that was personal. Everything seemed just right. All my problems and my sufferings suddenly seemed meaningless, ridiculous. Simply a misunderstanding of my true nature and everything around me. There was a feeling of acceptance and oneness. It was a moment of enlightenment. The euphoria and inexplicable rush of knowledge and understanding following this episode lasted for days. Again, this is a very temporary experience, but it changed her fundamentally. She entered a new positive phase of her life. She began to emerge from her depression. She never attempted suicide again. You know, she felt there was a new meaning and purpose to her life following this experience. So these are two examples of awakening experiences which are triggered by psychological turmoil. But one of the things which I found in my research was that, you know, as I said, these experiences are normally temporary. Even though they are life-changing, people do normally experience a return to their normal state of consciousness. But I found that in some cases, people said that they never shifted back to their normal consciousness. They remained in a heightened state of awareness. They said that, you know, they never, after this experience, they never returned to their previous identity. Something fundamental shifted inside them, and they were never the same people again. So I began to realize that in some cases, experiences of intense psychological turmoil could actually lead to a permanent shift. You know, they could actually lead to a permanent spiritual awakening. And that's what I began to investigate in my book. I began to examine cases where people had fundamentally shifted and become different people living in a heightened state of awareness following intense turmoil. This is related to, this is related to another question here. I'll just briefly ask you this question. And again, you can respond in the chat box. Have you ever had a bad experience involving stress, upset, suffering, and turmoil, which you feel that in the end made you a stronger and happier person? So again, please answer in the chat box. If you feel like it, you could go into a little bit more detail. You could mention the nature of the stress or suffering you went through. Everybody's saying yes, which is what I expected, because it's part of human life. As I said before, suffering is part of human life, and growth through suffering or turmoil is also part of human life. Everybody experiences what psychologists call post-traumatic growth. That's the official term in psychology for this phenomenon, post-traumatic growth. There's a famous saying, which I think was originally from Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher. He said, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. He was probably exaggerating a bit, but you can see his point. Bad experiences, they bring out resilience, they bring out an inner competence, and they bring out resources inside us which we were not aware of. It's almost as if, when you go through intense suffering, it breaks you down. But it's almost as if when you put yourself back together again, you reassemble yourself at a higher level of order, a higher level of harmony. That seems to be what's happened. It's like a phoenix rising from the ashes. When you rise from the ashes, you seem to assemble yourself at a higher level of order, at a higher level of harmony, a more integrated level, a higher functioning level. And as I say, in traditional psychology, that's a well-known phenomenon called post-traumatic growth. In fact, research shows that almost half of the people, maybe not, sometimes people say it's a third, maybe between a third and a half of all people who go through any particular type of trauma will experience growth in the following period, even if it takes years. Post-traumatic growth sometimes takes years to manifest itself, but it usually involves a heightened sense of appreciation and gratitude. It normally involves deeper, more authentic relationships. Interestingly, one thing I found in my research was that people always commented on a feeling of being able to relate more deeply and authentically to other people, a feeling of being able to be more intimate and authentic in their relationships. But people sometimes said that they had fewer friends than before, but the friendships they had were deeper and stronger. But it's almost as if, people let go of superficial relationships in favor of stronger and deeper, more intimate relationships. Also, people feel that they are stronger, more resilient, more confident, more competent. They also feel that they want to find a meaning to life. They explore spirituality, religion, or philosophy to try to find a meaning in life. So these are some of the benefits that come from experiencing trauma and turmoil. It's strange, really, because as human beings, we're sorry, I'm having problems trying to remove the chat box here. Oh, here we go. As I was saying, it's quite paradoxical, really, because as human beings, part of us wants our lives to be stable and secure and safe. Part of us wants to shy away from danger. But another part of us knows that trauma is the best way to grow. Not necessarily trauma, but challenge. We know that challenges help us to grow. And we also, when we do experience crises or traumatic experiences, I think intuitively we know that we can benefit from them. We know that we can become stronger, more resilient, and more authentic in their aftermath. I found in my research that some people would experience what I called transformation through turmoil. And I've actually written 2 books about this. I wrote an early book about 10 years ago called Out of the Darkness. So I found countless examples of people who go through intense trauma or turmoil. They report a sudden and dramatic transformation into a higher functioning state. Sometimes it's so dramatic that it happens in an instant. People can specify a particular moment when they experience transformation, almost as if there was a certain moment when their old self died and a new self emerged in its place. I found that it's not uncommon amongst prisoners and soldiers. In fact, in my book, Extraordinary Awakenings, I have 2 chapters about prisoners who experience spiritual awakening, because I found that I wouldn't say it's common, but it's certainly not uncommon. I found so many examples of prisoners who underwent spiritual transformation, not in a religious sense, but in a psychological sense. They felt that they shifted in some fundamental way. They became different people. They became higher functioning, more sensitive, more empathic people. And I pondered a lot about why this experience is so common in prisoners. And I came up with two reasons, actually. One was that in prison, some people are forced to explore themselves. They're forced to reflect and enter their own being, their own minds, in a way that they've never done before. Because prison is a place where there's a lot of solitude and inactivity, people are kind of thrown back into themselves. For many people, that's a painful experience, but for some people, it's a revelation that they sort of enter their own minds, they explore their own beings in a way they've never done before. And they start to analyze their behavior. And they realize that there's a part of themselves, there's a kind of inner space that they've never been aware of before. So it's revelatory just to go inside themselves and experience that inner space. And once you experience that inner space, I think you're never really the same person. You become a deeper person, a stronger person, a more conscious person once you step into that inner space. The second reason why I think prison can engender this transformation is that imprisonment is about letting go. When you go into prison, you have to let go of things. All of the things which define your identity are out there on the other side of the prison walls. All of your relationships, all of your roles in society, your ambitions, your possessions, and so forth. It's all on the other side. But in prison, you're forced to let go of your identity. And again, that's a painful experience for many people. But in a minority of people, letting go can lead to liberation. Letting go of identity can lead to a kind of dissolution of your normal identity and an emergence of a new identity, the emergence of a spiritually awakened identity. I also found that it's not uncommon again amongst people who attempt suicide. I'll tell you what, I'll show you an example of that in a short while. And also it's not uncommon in addicts. People sometimes experience what I call addiction release. That's a sudden freedom from craving. Obviously, this doesn't happen very often, but in a small minority of people, after years of addiction, after they've lost everything through their addiction, once they've ruined their relationships, they've lost all of their possessions, they've lost all of their ambitions, all of their self-respect, they've lost everything through their addiction. And suddenly, for no apparent reason, they may experience an awakening. And one way in which that awakening manifests itself is in a sudden freedom from craving, a sudden release from their addiction. And I'll give you an example of that in a short while. People often talk about transformation through turmoil as becoming a different person. People feel as though they are different people living in the same body. It's almost as if an entirely new self, an entirely new identity has emerged inside them. So here's a couple of quotes from people. One person said, "It's like there are two people. There's a before and after." Another person said, "There's no going back. I'm a different person now for the rest of my life." Another person said, "I've moved up to another level of awareness, which I know is going to stay with me. It's like the transformation that a caterpillar goes through during the chrysalis stage before emerging as a butterfly." That's quite a beautiful way of describing it. It's almost as if there is a new, higher functioning self which emerges from a lower normal self. And another metaphor which I used earlier is a phoenix rising from the ashes. Here's an example. This is a lady I interviewed and later became friendly with. She's called Irene, and she was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 43. She was told that her cancer was aggressive and she may only have 6 months to a year left to live. But rather than being broken down by her diagnosis, she reacted in an unusual way. This is how she describes feeling right after she was diagnosed with cancer and told that she may only have a short time left to live. She said, "It was the first time I'd seen death as a reality and realized that life is just temporary. The following day, I woke up and thought, I'm just so lucky to be alive, the fact that I'm still here. The air was so clean and fresh, and everything I looked at seemed so vibrant and vivid. The trees were so green, and everything was so alive. I became aware of this energy radiating from the trees. I had a tremendous feeling of connectedness." Like a lot of people who have this experience, she expected it to fade away. She thought it would be a temporary experience, but although it did sort of de-intensify to a degree, it remained constant at a lower level. This is how she described her ongoing state. She said, that feeling was really intense for the first few weeks, and it's remained ever since. It just blew me away. It really did. I used to just sit and think, this is amazing that things could just fall into place so quickly. As you've probably guessed from my description, Irene's cancer went into remission. And even though the cancer was in remission, she remained in this heightened state of awareness. It became her normal state. Everything changed, everything changed in her life. Before, she'd been, a kind of high achieving career person. I think she was the IT manager for a pharmaceutical company or something like that. But afterwards, she couldn't do that job anymore. She gave up her job and she retrained as a therapist. She began to work with other cancer patients. She retrained as a counselor. And, everything became much more beautiful around her. She had a new sense of the beauty of nature. That's a very common aspect of these experiences, that people feel that they are looking at the world in a completely fresh and vivid way, almost with a kind of vivid perception that children have. Everything looks much more real, almost as if a veil has fallen away and they're seeing things as they are rather than through a filter of familiarity. People sometimes talk about writing poetry. They start to write poetry because they feel inspired by their new awareness. Occasionally people talk about, painting as well. People generally become more creative, probably because, they're living in a state of inspiration, in a state of harmony with a new sense of well-being. So, somebody like Irene, that's incredibly lucky to go through this experience. And then the danger which triggered the experience, her cancer, faded away, but she retained this awareness. It really was like an awakening. She experienced it as, she'd woken up from the sleep that she'd been experiencing for the whole of her previous life. Here's another example. This is a lady called Jill Hicks, she was seriously injured in a terrorist attack in London in 2006. And she was sitting very close to one of the suicide bombers in one of the tube trains in London. There were a series of bombs on one particular day in London in 2006. And she was just a couple of meters away from one of the bombs. So she was seriously injured. Her legs were amputated below the knee. She was hovering on the brink of death in hospital for 2 or 3 weeks. She actually had a near-death experience where she left her body and she felt this amazing sense of euphoria. And she heard a voice say, come with me. You don't have to go back to your body. Just come with me. Everything will be fine. She called it the voice of death. But then she became aware that if she did leave her body and if she followed the voice of death, all of her friends and family would feel the terrible pain of the grief of bereavement. So she thought, no, I want to go back to my body because I don't want my friends and my family to go through the pain of grief. So she returned to her body. But once she became conscious again, once she recovered her health, she was a different person. She said that she was living, she called it life 2, because she was living a different life with a new set of values and a new awareness and a new perspective on reality. And one of the aspects of her transformation was not taking things for granted ever again. She said, "From the moment I was given the option of choosing life, I vowed that I would never take anything all that I have for granted again." So she talked about how, how she didn't take food or water for granted. She didn't take the world around her for granted. Everything looked real and beautiful. She was aware of the gift of being alive in the world. Even though her body was seriously injured, she still felt grateful to be alive in this body, to be conscious of the world around her. People often say after these experiences that life becomes more simple. And this is what Jill said. She said that, "I no longer look for complications and they don't come and find me. It's amazing. All the rubbish of life has just slid away. I feel liberated. My path is being laid and being lit every day. I can see so clearly where I'm meant to be going. It's like an airport runway where the bright lights along the strip guide the planes in." And like Irene, Jill didn't feel that she could continue living in the same way. Before the accident, she'd been a designer and an architect, but she couldn't do that anymore. She wanted to do something more altruistic, more purposeful and meaningful. So she began to work for charities. She founded her own charity, which she called Mad for Peace. And she began to spend her time speaking to youth groups. She spent a lot of time working with Islamic youth groups, trying to build bridges within the community and trying to promote peace in the community. Let me just give you one more example before we discuss the reasons why these transformations occur. This is one of the most people, when I do interviews about my book, people sometimes say to me, "What's your favorite story in the book?" Because the book is made up of a lot of stories of people who undergo spiritual awakening following various types of trauma. And I usually say Eve's story is my favorite story because it's such a remarkable, inspirational example of transformation through turmoil. Eve is a Scottish lady. She's in her mid-40s now. But from a very early age, from the age of 12, she was an alcoholic. And over 29 years of alcoholism, slowly her problem became more severe, and slowly her life became more chaotic and more filled with difficulties. And by the end of that period, she'd lost everything. She'd lost her friends. She'd lost contact with her family. She couldn't hold down a job. And she became homeless. She was homeless in Edinburgh, in Scotland, living on the street. She was going shoplifting to try to keep herself supplied with alcohol. And she said that she was a wreck. This is how she described it: a wreck, an empty shell. I'd walk a few steps and have to sit down or lie down. I had nothing to live for, nothing to give. And I thought, I can't do this anymore. I don't have the strength. She tried to give up drinking, but couldn't. So she decided that her only option was to attempt suicide, to commit suicide. She attempted suicide by throwing herself in front of a coach that was traveling at 40 miles an hour. But luckily, the coach driver swerved and she survived. But in that moment of survival, or in the moment of her suicide attempt, something shifted inside her. Following her suicide attempt, the police arrived at the scene. She thought she was going to be arrested. But the policeman was actually a nice guy and said, "Can I do something to help you? How did you get into this situation? Can I take you somewhere?" And she said, "Oh, just take me to my parents' house." She hadn't seen her parents for a long time, but the policeman drove her to her parents' house. And the mother said, "Well, do I have to give you a glass of wine because you're an alcoholic?" So her mother gave her a glass of wine. But Eve said that she couldn't drink the wine. She picked it up, lifted it, then put it down. She kept picking it up and putting it down. And she said it was a surreal experience because it wasn't me. She said it wasn't me that was putting it down. There seemed to be another self that was putting the glass of wine down. Then she was given some medication to deal with the withdrawal symptoms. And after that, when she regained consciousness, after she was knocked out for a while by the medication, she looked at herself in the mirror And this is how she described it. She said, "It was one of the most surreal experiences I've ever had. I had no idea who I was. I didn't connect with my reflection. I felt like a completely different person." So it was almost as if in that moment of her suicide attempt, a new self emerged inside her. It was as if her old identity as an alcoholic died and was replaced by a new spiritually awakened identity. And as you said, everything changed at that moment. She had a completely different relationship to the world around her. The world around her became more real. She had a sense of beauty. She had a sense of being able to connect with other people that she'd never had before. And she had a sense of well-being and a sense of self-respect that she'd never had before. And maybe most remarkably, she was free of the craving for alcohol. She said that she used to go to AA meetings and people would talk about the struggle of remaining sober day to day. And she said she felt guilty because she had no struggle at all. The craving had just disappeared. And that's what I call, that's an example of what I call addiction release. Another remarkable aspect of the experience was that she became free of trauma. In her 29 years as an alcoholic, she'd been through a lot of traumatic, horrific experiences, which would normally create a great deal of trauma. But somehow she became free of all of that trauma. And as I said, she's been free of her addiction for about 15 years now. But she just spent a lot of time working with AA in AA groups. And she spends most of her time in other kind of altruistic endeavors. So the big question is, why does this transformation occur? Why do some people experience this remarkable spiritual awakening in the midst of intense turmoil? This is one way of looking at it. I think what happens is that when people go through periods of intense trauma in their lives, it can break down their egos, their normal sense of identity. It can cause what I call ego dissolution. The ego is a bit like, if you imagine the ego as a house, it seems quite solid, quite well structured, quite stable. But when a period of intense trauma comes along, it's like an earthquake. It can just break down the house of the ego. Or maybe that it happens in a more gradual way. One way of explaining it is in terms of psychological attachments. Psychological attachments are the external things or the concepts which give us a sense of identity. So psychological attachments can be our beliefs about the world, our hopes about the future, our possessions, our self-image, our status, our achievements. All of these things give us a sense of identity. They are the building blocks of our identity. Our identities are often tied to our roles in society or the status that we have, the achievements that we've had in our lives, that we've made in our lives. So when all of these things are broken down, when we lose all of these things, the ego itself can dissolve away, can break down, because all of these things are taken away. So it's like a house suddenly collapsing when a certain number of bricks are taken away. And when ego dissolution occurs, in some people, it doesn't lead to just a breakdown. It doesn't lead to just an empty space where the old self was, because a new self seems to emerge and take over, if you like. A new self seems to emerge into the space which was left by the old ego dissolving. So it's almost as if in some people there is a latent higher self which is waiting to emerge. And when the old ego breaks down, this latent self emerges and takes over as a person's identity. One of the big questions here is, why does this transformation happen to some people and not others? And one factor seems to be that some people seem to be more open to transformational experiences. Some people seem to be more open to new experiences. They seem to have softer ego boundaries, which are more likely to be open to transformational experiences. Whereas some people have a very strong and solid and rigid ego, which seems to be, even in intense turmoil, it seems to be immovable and can't break down. So one thing I found in my research is that women seem to be more likely to undergo this experience. I'm not really sure why that is, but it could be connected to, that research in psychology suggests that women tend to be slightly more open to new experiences. They have a quality of openness, whereas some men have a sort of more controlled, more solid sense of self. So maybe that's a factor. But I think the biggest factor is that some people seem to be ready for this transformation. They seem to have a latent higher self, which is fully formed and fully integrated and just waiting for the opportunity to emerge. Whereas in other people, that latent higher self is not ready. It's not fully formed. It's a bit like, a chick, which is ready to hatch from an egg. So in certain people, they're just ready to hatch. But other people are maybe just not at that point yet. They're not ready for transformation. So when their ego breaks down, it is just a breakdown. There is no transformation because they're just not ready for transformation. But another factor is that it depends on your attitude to your experience. I found that many people who underwent this transformation, they could pinpoint a moment of acceptance or surrender where they stopped resisting or fighting their predicament. First of all, they acknowledged the predicament as a reality. They faced up to it. And then they opened themselves to it. They accepted it. They surrendered. They let go. And that was often the moment when they experienced transformation. So an attitude of acknowledgement and acceptance seems to be very important in these moments. I think that's why there is a connection to suicide, because often when people attempt suicide, they have given up. Obviously, if you're ready to attempt suicide, you've given up. You've given up hope. You've given up hope of gaining any happiness or meaning in life. You've given up your attachment to anything. So paradoxically, that can be, a fertile moment for transformation, because it's a surrender. So as I said, some people could pinpoint the exact moment when they underwent transformation, and it was sometimes at a moment of acceptance. Just as one example, there was a guy I wrote about in my earlier book, Out of the Darkness, and it was a guy called Michael Hutchison, who was, in the 90s, he was actually the author of a number of books on spirituality and technology, things like biofeedback and alpha waves and that kind of thing. But he underwent a severe accident. He was running one morning and he slipped and fell over a bridge onto a rocky riverbed, and he broke his spine. He became paralyzed and wheelchair bound. And as you'd expect, he was in a state of, depression for a long time afterwards. In fact, for 18 months afterwards, he was in a state of depression and frustration and bitterness afterwards. But one morning, 18 months after his accident, he was in a nursing home. He was being taken for a shower by a nurse. And he heard a voice inside his head say, "Michael, what are you doing? Why are you resisting it? Just let go." So the voice just said, "Let go, let go." And he did what the voice said. He just let go. He just opened himself. He surrendered to his predicament rather than resisting it. And he said that in that moment, he felt this tremendous sense of release and freedom and bliss, as if a dam had opened and a new feeling of bliss was flooding through. And after that, his attitude to his predicament was completely different, and his life was completely different. He felt this new sense of inner freedom and this new sense of beauty and realness of his surroundings. And interestingly, one thing about Michael is that before he had this transformation, he had a morphine drip to deal with the pain in his spine. But he said that after his transformation, he no longer needed the morphine drip, because he said that whenever he felt pain, he just went inside himself and dropped into bliss. He said dropped into bliss. So he had this ability to sort of just enter his own being and sense this inner bliss, which would enable him to transcend his pain. So yeah, that's a good example of the power of acceptance. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to guide you through an exercise to illustrate the power of acceptance. And these are the three stages which I identified in people who underwent transformation. And sometimes this happened in prisoners as well. A lot of prisoners were initially very resistant to their predicament. They were full of frustration, but they went through a process of acknowledgement, self-exploration, and acceptance, which would sometimes lead to transformation. So the first stage is acknowledgement. That's facing the reality of your predicament rather than mentally pushing it away. Bereavement's a good example because, bereavement is probably the most painful common experience that human beings can go through, the most traumatic specific experience that we have in our lives. And often when we undergo bereavement, we don't want to face up to the reality of it. We don't want to contemplate the reality of it, the reality of our loss. We want to escape the pain. We want to escape contemplating the reality of how our lives are without that person in them. But when people actually do acknowledge the reality of their loss and they face up to the reality of their lives, then they are more likely to experience growth and transformation. And that's often followed by a period of exploration, when you go inside yourself and explore your own experiences. That involves being aware of negative feelings and the thoughts that are associated with them. And what people normally find is that when you go into yourself and explore your own thoughts and feelings, initially it may be painful. You may sense an inner discord, but after a while, the thoughts and feelings become less painful. Though even in the case of bereavement, the pain or the loss begins to fade away once you face it and explore it. The worst thing is when you don't go into yourself, when you don't acknowledge the predicament, that kind of repression actually enables the feeling to grow more painful. It encourages the trauma to become more intense. And the final stage which I identified is, as I've just described, acceptance. It's opening yourself to the reality of the situation, embracing it, surrendering to it. And that, as I said, is often the moment when transformation occurs. So, as I said, I'm going to do a little exercise now on acceptance. So I'll stop showing my slides for a moment. And I'm going to illustrate an experience which I call the alchemy of acceptance. As I said, this applies to transformation through turmoil, but in a sense, acceptance is a powerful experience in every area of our lives. Often a lot of the unhappiness and frustration that we experience in our lives is caused by an attitude of resistance. When we resist elements of our lives, it creates a sense of discord. It creates frustration. Whereas if you accept elements of your life, then there is a sense of oneness. Resistance causes duality and discord, but acceptance creates a feeling of oneness because you are embracing every aspect of your life. And therefore, a sense of harmony and oneness imbues the whole of your life. So let me, first of all, read another of my poems called The Alchemy of Acceptance. This is from a book of poems of mine called The Clear Light, which I published a couple of years ago. So this explains what I mean by the alchemy of acceptance. After this poem, I'll guide you through the exercise. The alchemy of acceptance. Emptiness can be a vacuum, cold and hostile, dark with danger. Or emptiness can be radiant space, glowing with soft stillness. And the only difference between them is acceptance. A task may seem tedious, a chore to rush through reluctantly, or a task may seem rewarding, a process to relish with an attentive mind that reveals more richness the more present you become. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Pain may seem unbearable, searing through you from a sharp, concentrated point, so that you have no choice but to resist, to try to escape the pain, to push it away. Or pain can be a sensation that you can move towards and merge with, that no longer has a center, that dissipates through your being, until it becomes soft and numb, no longer pain at all. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Trauma can break you down to nothing, destroy the identity you spent your whole life building up, like an earthquake that leaves you in ruins. Or trauma can transform you, break open new depths and heights of your being, give rise to a greater structure, a miraculous new self. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Life can be frustrating, full of obstacles, with desires for a different life disturbing your mind. Or life can be fulfilling, full of opportunities, with a constant flow of gratitude for the gifts you have. And the only difference between them is acceptance. So let me guide you through a meditative exercise to illustrate the transformational power of acceptance, which I believe people experience in transformation through turmoil. Let's close our eyes again for a moment, as we did at the beginning of the session. Again, let's close our eyes, and for a moment, let's return our attention to our breathing, just feeling the air as it enters and leaves your nose, brushing the inside of your nose. Feeling how your stomach rises and falls with your breath. Feeling how you become a little more relaxed with each breath, as each breath becomes slower and deeper and longer. And now let's bring our attention back into our inner space, feeling a sense of spaciousness and stillness within our consciousness, feeling the energy of our inner being stretching through the whole of our inner bodies, down through our shoulders, into our arms and hands, down through our chests, down to our waists, into the legs, down to the feet. Just feel the energy of your inner body stretching in all of the different parts of your body, filling you internally with a sense of energetic well-being. Filling you with a sense of spacious stillness. Now let's return our attention to our consciousness, to our minds. Now I'm going to ask you to create an image in your mind. I'd like you to imagine that you are sitting or standing near the top of a mountain, maybe even at the peak of a mountain, looking down at a landscape that's spread around you. So as you stand at the side of the mountain, you can see this vast landscape beneath you and around you. And the landscape is the landscape of your life. Everything which constitutes your life is spread in front of you in this landscape. It contains your past. It contains the situations which constitute your life now, all of your responsibilities and jobs and tasks, the places you visit in your daily life, the people who you encounter in your daily life, your profession, your achievements, everything which constitutes your life is spread out before you in this landscape. And as you survey this landscape, I want you to be aware of any particular aspect of your life, any particular place in this landscape where you feel some resistance, a certain part of your life that maybe you find difficult to accept, which causes you frustration. It could be a part of your daily life. It could be one of the tasks in your job, or it could be some of the people you meet in your job. It could be a particular environment which you don't feel comfortable in. It could be a chore or a responsibility that you have to fulfill in your life. Or it could be a certain aspect of your life situation. Maybe you feel that you have not achieved what you should have done, or you're not doing what you should do. Maybe you feel that your relationships are not satisfactory, or that there's something wrong with your life situation. Could be the relationships in your life or the environment you live in. Or it could be something about life itself, some fundamental thing about life, such as the aging process or even death. Maybe you find the prospect of death difficult to accept. But just for this exercise, I'd like you to just focus on one particular aspect of your life where you feel some resistance. And now what I'd like you to do, as you are surveying the landscape and once you've located this particular aspect of your life, I'd like you to imagine that there is a cord or a string of some kind connecting you to this aspect of your life which you feel resistance towards. There is something which binds you to this aspect of your life, a cord, a physical connection to it. So I'll just give you a moment to locate that and to feel that physical bond, that cord that connects you to this aspect of your life. And now, what I'd like you to do is to take a long, deep breath. And as you breathe out, I want you to let go of your resistance to this aspect of your life. I want you to feel that the cord which connects you to it is fading away as you breathe out and as you let go. So as you breathe out slowly, just let go of your resistance and imagine that the cord is melting away. Let's do that together. Just breathe in slowly. Take a long, deep inner breath and breathe out slowly, letting go of resistance to this aspect of your life. And as you do so, as you let go, you feel a sense of openness, a sense of embracing your life. We can do that a couple more times. A long, deep inner breath, a slow out breath, letting go of resistance, opening yourself to your life, allowing that cord to melt away, feeling a sense of liberation and release as you let go of your resistance. Maybe just one last time, just take an inner breath, and just to make sure that the resistance is completely faded, just let go, open yourself to the landscape of your life, letting go of resistance. Feeling a sense of release, a sense of harmony. As I said before, when we let go of resistance, we feel a sense of oneness, because resistance creates duality between us and reality. Resistance creates discord between us and reality. So when we enter a mode of acceptance, there is suddenly a sense of oneness with reality and a sense of harmony with reality. So just return to that image of yourself sitting or standing by the side of a mountain or at the peak of a mountain, just looking at the landscape of your life. And as you survey the whole landscape of your life, I want you to completely open yourself to the reality of your life, completely open yourself to that landscape, accepting every aspect of your life as it is, with no discord or disharmony. Just embrace the whole of your life right now as it is. Accept it as it is and appreciate it as it is. And as you open yourself to every aspect of your life, as you embrace the whole of the landscape of your life, you can feel a sense of harmony. You can feel a sense of oneness. You can feel your oneness with reality. And now, let's allow that image to fade from our minds. Allow the image to fade and become aware again of the spacious stillness of your consciousness. Retain that feeling of harmony and oneness. As you become aware again of your breathing, feeling the air brushing the inside of your nose again. And let's slowly open our eyes again and bring this exercise to a close. Hopefully, in that exercise, you are able to experience what I call the alchemy of acceptance. And as I say, that's essentially the experience which people go through in transformation through turmoil. The moment of acceptance of their life situation, the moment of acceptance of their predicament. And that moment of acceptance is an opening. It's a spiritual opening which triggers their transformation, or which enables their transformation to take place. Before we have a few moments of questions, there's just one final thing I'd like to mention about these experiences. And what I'd like to point out is that these experiences have what I call an evolutionary aspect to them. I think of spiritual awakening as an unfolding of consciousness, not just human consciousness, but consciousness in general. In spiritual awakening, people's awareness becomes more intense and more expansive. And if you think about it, that's what's always happened all the way through evolution, right from the very first simple-celled creatures, the amoebae. From that point onwards, there has been a gradual opening, a gradual intensification of consciousness. As living beings become more complex, they also become more aware of their surroundings, more aware of their own being, more aware of each other. And that's happened all the way through evolution, through the most simple life forms to the most complex life forms, such as human beings. And in spiritual awakening, that process continues further. There's a further expansion of awareness. So I think, in my research, I found that these experiences are not uncommon. They seem to be becoming more common. More and more people seem to be undergoing transformation through turmoil. So to me, it seems almost as if there is a new type of awareness which is manifesting itself in the world, a new type of human awareness, almost as if human beings are moving towards a new level of consciousness, a new level of evolution. In my view, we have to collectively develop a new way of seeing the world, a new way of relating the world, in order to safeguard our future as a species. Because at the moment, we're facing a lot of different crises in the world, the most serious being a variety of ecological problems, which may endanger our future prospects of survival. And the only way to safeguard our future is to sense to sense our harmony with nature, to develop a new awareness of nature, a new awareness of each other. to develop a new sense of respect for nature. And I think it's almost as if the crises we are facing now as a species, they could be, it could be these crises themselves which are causing transformation. Let me just share a slide with you for a moment before I finish. Where am I? On this slide, there's an image which my son drew for me. Because one morning, probably about 10 years ago now, my son, when he was 8 years old, he woke up and said, "Daddy, I've just had a really strange dream." And I said, "Yeah, well, tell me about it." And he said, "In my dream, I saw the world as if it was an eggshell, and it broke open, and a butterfly flew out." So I said, "Oh, can you draw that for me?" And he drew this image of the earth like an egg splitting open, and a butterfly emerging from the egg of the earth. And I thought, wow, this is a perfect symbol of a collective transformation through turmoil. It's a perfect symbol of a collective spiritual awakening, which may be arising in the midst of the turmoil that we're experiencing. So I think we may be experiencing a collective awakening in response to global turmoil. That may be the reason why so many people are undergoing what I call transformation through turmoil. There's actually research showing that spiritual experiences are becoming more common. They have become more common over the past few decades. So I think, this transformation may be occurring, and I think we all have a responsibility to contribute to this process by developing ourselves spiritually, by moving towards spiritual awakening ourselves. That will contribute to the process of collective awakening, which our species may be undergoing. Okay, everybody. Thanks for listening to my talk. Thanks for engaging with my exercises. You can take a look at my website here if you'd like further information. And there are a couple of my books if you're interested in following them up. Thank you. We have some time for questions, I believe, if anyone would like to ask questions.
Thank you, Steve. That was great. Well, I can start us off. I've always felt that we grow and awaken either by deliberate choice or what I call default. And default would be the ways that you write about in this book, through turmoil, through crisis, and after doing our utmost to resist the unwanted circumstances, we finally arrive at a point of surrender and acceptance, and we stop fighting. And at that point, we transcend the mindset that kept us stuck in grief or addiction or death or whatever, the particular conviction that life had to look a certain way. Would you say the default way is much more prevalent than the way of choice? The way of choice, an example of the way of choice, which you also have in your book, is being on a spiritual path and choosing to grow spiritually because we're drawn to that, and perhaps the way of choice is becoming more prevalent as people deliberately seek transcendence through meditation and other practices. But which one would you say, is it more prevalent still, the default way?
I think there are so many people around the world, probably hundreds of millions of people around the world, who are following paths of spiritual awakening, paths of spiritual practice, whether it's specific spiritual paths like Buddhism or the Kabbalah or Sufism, or whether it's a kind of eclectic mix of different practices or spontaneous practices which people follow. But yeah, I think that is probably the most common way in which people move towards spiritual awakening, because it's so prevalent around the world. But transformation through turmoil, I think it's much more common than most people realize. I think there are thousands of spiritually awakened people around who don't know they are spiritually awakened because they don't have a background in spirituality. They don't really interpret their experience in those terms, but they've undergone a transformation through bereavement or cancer or addiction or whatever, without realizing that it's spiritual in nature. So I think that transformation is certainly common, and it's so dramatic that it can take people through what might be years or decades of spiritual practice and years of spiritual development in an instant. It can cause such a radical transformation. It's like a kind of a quantum leap of spiritual development. But I think certainly the gradual path is probably most common because so many people follow it around the world.
Anybody else have a question?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. So my comment, hi Gloria. My comment is this morning I was talking to a man in my neighborhood whose wife has a horrible, terrible, unbearable illness. So I asked him, how she was. So he told me, and they happen to be spiritual in a certain way. I know they go to church, and she had asked another friend of mine to pray for her. It's a pretty serious illness. So I mentioned to him, well, I'm about to watch this presentation on how trauma can bring about spiritual transformation. And then he said to me, and it was sort of an unusual thing, but it's consistent with one of the statements, you made early on, Steve. And he said, because he was a cameraman in the news world, so he said, so I think he's been in situations of war, or his colleagues have been. And he said, I never heard this saying, but he said, well, that's what they say. There are no atheists in the foxhole. And I thought, oh, I never heard this saying, but apparently it's common. And I guess men in war have different levels of spiritual experiences, like the transformation you talk about, or simply praying, that they survive. So I thought it was kind of interesting that he said this right before coming into this presentation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah,
I've heard that saying also.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly, it's not common for soldiers to experience spiritual moments, or to undergo transformation. I've got a whole chapter in my book about it because I found loads of examples, not just temporary examples, but but permanent spiritual shifts. At my university, we have a master's degree, which is called interdisciplinary psychology, but it's largely about spirituality. It's largely spiritual psychology. We just call it interdisciplinary psychology, so the managers don't really know what it is. To keep it quiet.
Transpersonal psychology?
Yeah, it's kind of transpersonal psychology.
Okay.
But we've had a few ex-soldiers on the course who've had powerful spiritual experiences in Iraq or Afghanistan, ex-British soldiers. And they've come on the course because they want to understand their experiences. They want to create a kind of intellectual framework to make sense of it, rather than thinking that they're crazy or there's something wrong with them. So yeah, I do think these experiences are not uncommon in soldiers or military people. Paul has got his hand up.
Yes. First of all, thanks for all of the work you're doing. I really appreciate it.
Welcome.
And what I'm intrigued by is what's next on your agenda. What new thing has captured your imagination?
Good question. I've got a new book coming out either later this year or early next year, and it's a slightly different topic to my other books. I'm looking into the consequences of separation, I think, or disconnection. Spirituality is about connection. It's about oneness. It's about harmony. So I'm looking into people who experience the opposite, people who are highly disconnected, people who are so disconnected that other people, are not really real to them. They see other people as objects, and the outside world is not wholly real to them. So sometimes these people, they're called psychopaths or narcissists, but I'm looking into the psychopathology of separation. And I'm suggesting that human nature or human development is about increasing connection, moving towards connection, moving away from disconnection towards connection and oneness. And that human goodness is about connection. Whereas evil is, if you want to use the word evil, it's about disconnection. It's about separation. But as we become more connected, as we become more empathic and more compassionate and more open to other people, we become more altruistic. And, that's what goodness is. Goodness is connection. So that I've devised a model which I call the continuum of connection, which expresses all of these different aspects of human behavior and all of these different aspects of human nature.
How soon can we expect that book?
Well, my publisher said either November, December, or maybe early next year. Okay. I recently submitted the manuscript to the publisher.
Thank you.
That's exciting. Yeah, it seems to me that one of the characteristics of awakening is the realization that we're not alone, even in our solitude, and we actually start to relish solitude more. So one could say that if someone feels alone or lonely, it's due to the belief that we're separate, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's one of the characteristics of the people I mentioned, the people who experience an extreme sense of separateness. That they are incredibly unhappy people because they are so separate. And they feel hostile towards the world and towards other people because they feel this frustration of extreme separateness, this kind of intense solitude, not solitude, intense loneliness, because they're trapped inside themselves.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a really nice poem by the author D.H. Lawrence where he talks about solitude and loneliness and describes how they are different things. That solitude is one of life's greatest pleasures, and that true solitude is a feeling of connection to the whole of the universe. It's the opposite of loneliness. True solitude is feeling your oneness with the whole of the universe.
Yeah.
Cara?
Cara has her hand up, but Cara, if you want to, that's my daughter.
All right.
I just wondered what your thoughts are on collective trauma.
Collective trauma. Could you be more specific? How do you mean? What kind of collective?
I mean, the pandemic could be one example.
Oh, yeah.
War could be another, the trauma in Afghanistan, name a country.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the pandemic's a good example because obviously the whole world went through a period of trauma during the pandemic. And I think the whole world experienced some degree of post-traumatic growth. In fact, there is some research showing that various parts of the world have experienced post-traumatic growth due to the pandemic. So, hopefully it was a terrible time, but hopefully something good will come out of it. Oh, I'm sure something good has come out of it and will even more, develop even more. But yeah, I think collective trauma can be very powerful. It can be incredibly negative, but also it can lead to collective post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth can occur on a global level. And as I suggested at the end of the presentation, maybe that's one of the reasons why there appears to be a collective spiritual awakening underway, because we have been experiencing global trauma for a few decades, and maybe the pandemic will contribute to that. There's also research in psychology showing that natural disasters like earthquakes or terrorist attacks, they produce collective post-traumatic growth as well. So yeah, there is a form of collective post-traumatic growth,
which is what we need to move forward and avoid total catastrophe, right?
Renee had her hand up.
Okay, Renee.
Hi, Renee. I think you need to unmute yourself.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. My question is,
how are you?
As a young person, I experienced a transformational experience. And I have had people tell me that they felt that this was the over emotional expression of a young girl's hyper emotional state. And I wondered, do you have any research or statistics that show this sort of thing happening to children? And if you believe there could be some validity to the notion that when you're young and your identity is not yet fully developed, that this could have been the result of something else going on, instead of just, as you have indicated, a readiness or a dissolution of your identity.
Not really. In my experience or in my research, I haven't found many examples of. I think were you about 14 or 15 when it happened?
14.
Yeah. I haven't found many examples in young people. But one of the things I have found is that I've spoken to some young people who've had these experiences, and they've actually repressed them because they didn't understand them. You know, people who were living in a culture which didn't support these experiences. For example, there was one woman I spoke to, a woman called Donna. She had a near-death experience in a car crash when she was 15. She was suddenly outside her body, filled with this tremendous sense of peace, looking down from above. And suddenly everything made sense. Suddenly she felt that, you know, life was meaningful, and she knew the meaning of life. She knew the purpose of life. And then she was, a few seconds later, she was back in her body with feeling terrible pain. And she was in hospital for a few weeks. But she still felt a sense of bliss, but she didn't know how to describe her experience to other people. And she tried to describe it. They thought, but somebody said, "Oh, you sound like you've gone crazy. What happened to you in the car? You know, if it's some kind of, you must have had a breakdown." And she tried to speak to the doctor. The doctor didn't understand it. He said she was having some sort of post-operative shock or something like that. So she repressed the experience. She realized that it was kind of unacceptable and repressed it and tried to forget about it. And that's not uncommon. I spoke to 3 or 4 people who had that experience. They just repressed their awakening experience. But it came back years later. It came back because you can't repress these experiences. They're so fundamental and they're so life-changing that you can't keep them down. They will always emerge at some point. So yeah, I think you didn't repress your experience, did you? You allowed it to manifest itself. So maybe that was the difference between you and other young people. I think if we lived in cultures that were more accepting of spiritual experiences, then people wouldn't have to repress them, which would make life a lot easier for these people, because it's not, repressing these experiences causes a lot of frustration and depression in later life. But you were able to, express your experience and integrate it. And, I think you allowed it to change your life, I guess.
I did. Thank you.
If the
Thanks,
adults
Renee.
if the adults around those children had a frame of reference for it, it would be helpful. I had a near drowning experience when I was 10. And I also went into a very, very euphoric state that I knew it was okay. And I was, when I realized I couldn't take another breath, and I let out my breath, and I had this wonderful, blissful feeling. But I managed to survive, obviously. And it never occurred to me to talk to anybody about it at that time. In fact, I didn't want to talk about it because I thought the adults will never let me in the ocean again.
I understand.
I never felt like I was repressing it either. It was, I came away from that with 2 kind of convictions. And one was, I'll never be afraid of drowning because it's so peaceful. And the other one was, when things are really, really crazy and they're out of your control, you just relax, because that's what saved me. I relaxed and I floated up, and then I could find my way out,
Wow.
So, so those were like kind of personal myths that came of that.
Wow. Wow.
Mm.
And do you think that experience was, did it sort of pull you in a spiritual direction in your life? Do you think that was why you became
I
interested?
always had a spiritual direction. But yeah, I mean, I didn't see it as spiritual at the time. I just saw it as, drowning is very peaceful. And the thing to do when things are totally out of your control is just let go, just relax.
Right.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, nice. Beautiful.
Mhm.
Those experiences are very common in falls as well. When people fall from mountains or from balconies,
Mhm.
even though it's just a few seconds, they feel this tremendous euphoria, this sense of time slowing down. And
Mhm.
sometimes they have visions of their past experiences, a kind of life review.
Mhm.
And yeah, then they feel, even though they're in danger of dying, they feel this tremendous sense of peace and calmness and detachment.
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder, is there any reason to be afraid of death? Probably not. No. When it comes, we can be afraid of it, but I think when it comes, we naturally embrace it, and we feel, maybe not everybody, but I think most of us will naturally embrace it and feel a sense of serenity and acceptance.
Miguel has his hand up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi.
Hi.
I just want to go back to something that Kara kind of opened a can of worms, right? So for many people, the pandemic resulted in a lot of loneliness and social isolation. And it was particularly pronounced in seniors and older people who are already more likely to experience isolation and financial insecurity. And I was wondering, also the consequences for children was pretty great as well. Although you could say perhaps that the parents had more time to spend quality time with their kids at home, but at the same time, children were stressed out by, I guess, not having the social contacts in the schools. So could you maybe elaborate a little more about the collective trauma events that we just experienced for the last 3 years, and we're trying to get over it?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question about it. It was a terrible experience for many, many people. But terrible experiences do bring post-traumatic growth. Sometimes it takes, as I said in the presentation, it takes a few years to manifest itself. But the most awful experiences can lead to the deepest, the most powerful growth. And there have been a few studies already in psychology that have shown that the pandemic has led to post-traumatic growth. So, I'm not saying that it kind of offsets all of the terrible experiences that people have been through. Nothing offsets that. But it does, but post-traumatic growth will inevitably take place. It has inevitably taken place. It always does in any traumatic situation. The most intense, as I said, the most intense traumatic experiences do produce the most intense post-traumatic growth. Not in everybody, but certainly in a significant proportion of the population. As I said before, studies show that between a third and a half of all people undergo post-traumatic growth following any type of trauma. So that, so hopefully between a third and a half of the world's population will experience post-traumatic growth in the aftermath of this pandemic.
All the horrors of death that they've seen in the hospitals and that they couldn't cope with?
Well, judging by previous examples and experiences of post-traumatic growth, yeah, some of them will, yeah. Post-traumatic growth has been identified in people who've undergone torture, who've witnessed the murder of relatives or friends. in the most extreme types of trauma do lead to post-traumatic growth. So definitely a certain proportion of the doctors and nurses who've experienced death and horror during the pandemic will lead to post-traumatic growth. So yeah, so the answer is yes. In some people anyway.
It all depends on the resistance they have.
Maybe it depends on whether they are ready for transformation. It depends on their attitude towards their experiences. Well, it's certainly likely that they'll undergo growth and transformation.
So, I think I formulated the question. What about in your experience as a social psychologist or social worker of sorts, with your experiences during this pandemic? What were they with your kids and with your contacts?
Well, I had both negative. Like a lot of people, I had both negative and positive experiences. On the one hand, I enjoyed spending a lot of time with my kids because they weren't going to school. On the other hand, it was very hard for my mother. My mother was in a nursing home. She wasn't allowed to go out. She didn't go out for a year or more. So that was very hard to deal with. But yeah, I think everybody had the same experience. Some people had certain positive aspects, as you mentioned before. But, obviously there were many severely negative aspects too. So I guess mine was similar. My wife is also, she's a hospital worker. So she experienced a lot of stress as well, because obviously that was the most intense, the most stressful site of, the pandemic in hospitals and areas of healthcare. But yeah, I think I have undergone some degree of growth as well through those experiences. Paul, have you still got your hand up?
Yeah. Thank you very much. That is a personal experience that you've shared with us. I think that was great. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel.
So my question is, from your perspective, what are the parallels between your work and that of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, she I'm sure most people have heard of her, but she did a lot of work with the grief process and people who were undergoing the experience of death. And her findings were similar, that she emphasized, I can't remember she had a 5-stage model, didn't she, of dealing with grief and bereavement and encountering death yourself. But acceptance was an important part of her model, wasn't it? So I guess that's a parallel.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We might have time for one more short question.
I didn't really have another question. I just really wanted to say thank you to Steve for all of the work that you do. I know it's made a great difference in my life to have had your work validate my experience. And I thank you so much. And it's great to see you again.
Thanks, Renee. Thanks, Renee. Yeah, it's great to see you again too. And thanks for sharing your story in my book. It's a really beautiful, inspirational story of spiritual awakening and how spiritual awakening can permeate somebody's life and, and lead to a shift in values and a new relationship to the world. So thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I will reiterate Renee's thank you. Thank you so much, Steve. And I recommend this book, Extraordinary Awakenings. It is a really fascinating book, and I just really loved it. It's very handy for anyone, because we all go through crises of some sort or another throughout our lives, and it's a wonderful reference point for those times in our lives or in someone else's life that we love. So thank you so much, Steve, for joining us today, and thank you all for attending. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.